There are few women in the Bible who have as much mystery surrounding them as Mary Magdalene. Even non-Christians are obsessed with her, and her name is whispered in so many conspiracies about Jesus, it's enough to make your head spin. And this isn't a new phenomenon. It's been going on for thousands of years. Even from the earliest days of the Christian faith, Mary Magdalene has been the subject of innuendo, rumor, and even a non-canonical gospel. But what does the Bible tell us about Mary? And how and why has she been maligned throughout the centuries? While the Bible doesn't tell us a whole lot about Mary Magdalene, it's clear that she was very important to Jesus' ministry. In the accepted Gospels, we only have one clue about Mary's life before Jesus, and that's in Luke 8:1-3, which tells us Jesus cast 7 demons out of her. But it's from that moment Mary Magdalene does a complete life turnaround and follows Jesus all the way. And according to Luke 8, we know Mary Magdalene, along with many other women, supported Jesus and the disciples financially. So she had means, income, and wealth. We also know that she was incredibly brave. At Jesus' arrest, when all the disciples abandoned Jesus like rats off a sinking ship, Mary Magdalene stuck around. Writing suggests she was there at Jesus' mock trial and heard Pilate's offering of Barabbas instead of Jesus. She actually heard the same crowd that had welcomed Jesus into Jerusalem with palm fronds later chanting, "Crucify him." Mary saw Jesus beaten and humiliated, and even at the cross with Jesus' blood flowing like rivers onto the ground, Mary was there. And according to John 20, Mary was the first to see him resurrected and was commissioned by Jesus to tell the others of his resurrected life. And it's inferred she was with the disciples at Pentecost in Acts 1:14. In fact, Mary is mentioned 12 times by name in the Gospels. That's more than most of the apostles. But other than that, Mary Magdalene is a mystery. But still, the mere fact that she's mentioned the way she is in the Gospels is pretty amazing. Jesus had many followers, not just the 12. It stated Jesus had thousands of people that would come to listen to him multiple times. We don't know their names, but we know Mary's. And let me tell you, this is very uncommon in ancient texts, and Greek texts in particular. We got to get out of our modern minds here. Since few women in the ancient world knew how to read or write, most of our info about their lives comes to us filtered through the eyes of men. Influential Greek writers such as Hesiod, Aristotle, Pericles, Euripides, Hipponax, and a slew of others wrote negatively of women. And even in a court of law, a woman's testimony was regarded as dubious and too easily swayed by emotion. So a woman being the first witness to the resurrection would have immediately cast her story into doubt among early Greek readers. Yet, here Mary is, turning everything upside down, the first proclaimer of the resurrected life of Jesus. This is a big deal, and maybe it was too big a deal to some early church fathers. Many modern scholars believe that because of the way that Jesus empowered women, which he did. I mean, look at the longest conversation Jesus has with another human being in the Bible, the woman at the well, and other mentions of Jesus publicly engaging women in conversation, which was a big no-no at the time, and appearing to Mary after the resurrection. This made many ancient male church leaders, and modern ones, uncomfortable, especially regarding Mary. And because of this, we begin to see attempts to diminish her role and worth. Because there's a lot of false things about Mary that the Western world has come to accept as facts that just ain't true. Were you taught that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute? It's a common trope. But there are absolutely no definitive scriptural references to Mary Magdalene as being a prostitute. Zero. She's been tied to the prostitute who washes Jesus' feet in Luke 7. And she's also been popularly tied to the woman caught in adultery in John 8, even in modern movies like Passion of the Christ. But the Bible doesn't name either of these women as Mary. We don't know who those women are. And since Mary Magdalene is mentioned by name so many times, if Mary were those women, she would have been identified as such. But she wasn't. So where did this story come from? Some of this early discoloring of Mary Magdalene may have come from how Mary began to take on a significant role in what we now call Gnostic Christian sects. While Mary's role and the role of women in general was being diminished in what was becoming traditional church thought, in Gnostic works, Mary's role was being elevated, such as in the Gospel of Thomas, the Pistis Sophia, the Dialogue of the Savior, the Gospel of Philip, and the Gospel of Mary. And some argue that Mary Magdalene took an elevated form in the Gnostic faiths, with Peter often portrayed as an adversary to Mary because of the overt diminishing of her place in the Gospels by some early church fathers. So while Peter represented traditional male thought in some of these Gnostic works, Mary represented the opposite, the yin to the yang, so to speak, with some Gnostic works referring to Mary as the one loved by Jesus more than the others. And in traditional church thought among church fathers claiming lineage to the apostles, that won't gonna fly. And then there's Pope Gregory the Great, who during his Easter sermon in 591 used his papal authority to declare that Mary was the sinful woman mentioned in Luke 7, strengthening the story of Mary's life as a prostitute. And Pope Gregory asserted that Mary Magdalene and Mary of Bethany were the same person. And according to him, Mary's sins were compounded by the fact that the oil used by the woman in Luke 7 to anoint Jesus' feet was also used by Mary for sensual purposes, thereby giving rise to the idea that Mary was a vain and lustful woman. And with that, boys and girls, in Western Christianity anyway, Mary as a prostitute was off to the races. Among other things, stories began circulating that Magdala, where Mary was reportedly from, was known in ancient days for producing prostitutes. But during the 12th through the 14th centuries, the French Cathars challenged the church's prevailing beliefs about Mary Magdalene. They believed that Mary was not only the wife of Jesus in the divine world, but also his concubine in what they termed the world of illusion, the world that they believed we all inhabit in our everyday lives. And likely sourcing off of earlier Gnostic texts, the Cathars may have regarded Jesus and Mary's relationship in erotic terms, with Mary being the woman that Jesus loved more than any other disciple. But again, this may have been more spiritually minded than physically minded, as the Cathars promoted celibacy and an ascetic lifestyle. But Mary being Jesus' consort, that didn't fly with the church. So the Cathars, they were exterminated in a murderous crusade that makes Game of Thrones look like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And the character extermination of Mary continued throughout the Middle Ages. In the 13th century, Jacobus wrote, "As rich as Mary was, she was no less beautiful, and so entirely had she abandoned her body to pleasure that she was no longer called by any other name than the sinner." He went on to write that Mary preached in Marseille, where she converted the ruling family, enabled the queen to have a son, and then resurrected the queen after she died in childbirth. And Mary then retreated into the wilderness, lived alone for 30 years before being carried off to heaven by the angels. And even up to the 20th century, Magdalene houses, or Magdalene asylums if you want to be real about it, were created as halfway houses for fallen women, women guilty of prostitution or who became pregnant outside of marriage, and young girls who had been abandoned by their families. And while the character assassination of Mary Magdalene by the Catholic Church ended in 1969 with the refutation of her being guilty of prostitution, the damage had already been done. And most folks still incorrectly identify this important woman as a prostitute. Kind of sucks. And this suppression of Mary's role in Jesus' ministry has led to crazy conspiracy theories and resuscitations of old ideas, such as the reason the church diminished her role was because she was Jesus' wife and with Jesus had children. And that legend is way older than the Da Vinci Code, by the way. But again, there's no scriptural evidence there. Zero. And there's probably a good reason why. Because if Jesus was the literal Son of God, that meant his DNA was divine. And what happened the last time divine creatures supposedly mated with humans? Yeah, not good. So, if Jesus was indeed divine, the early church would have had a hard time accepting more than a master-disciple type relationship with Mary. But regardless of all of that, Mary was obviously very important to early believers. Think about it. Christianity as a faith that people were willing to die for began at that moment at the tomb. At the crucifixion, almost everyone ran like cowards. But after the crucifixion, people were willing to die for Jesus. And it was Mary at the tomb, Mary becoming the first proclaimer that he is risen, that helped begin this process. Jesus chose Mary, a woman, to be the first speaker of the resurrected Christ. Mary, in the moment when she's most distraught at the empty tomb, when all hope was lost, in that moment, Jesus calls her by her name, Mary. What an honor. A woman who had suffered but who had been healed. A woman who had followed Jesus, financially supported Jesus, never abandoned Jesus, even at the cross, and was there to anoint his mangled, broken body. And Jesus called her by her name. Her name is Mary Magdalene. And it's time we give this woman the honor that she's due.